This episode of 6'5 Guys is brought to you by Benchmark Barrels, world-class accuracy. Defiance Machine, defying tradition with innovation. JC Steel Targets, the industry leader in quality AR-500 steel targets.
Welcome to 6'5 Guys. I'm Steve Lawrence. Many of you may be familiar with our series of load development videos. One of the things that we did not cover in depth in those series of videos is the analysis process itself. Now, a couple of years ago, I actually developed an Excel model to help in that process, but didn't provide a lot of instructions about how to use it or customize it for your needs. The good news is I've upgraded that model to version 2.0, and in this video, we're going to cover how to use it, and I'll also be providing tips in performing the load development analysis. So stay tuned, fire up Excel, and let's start to geek out. In this episode, we're really going to cover two major categories of information. The first, as I had mentioned, is we're first going to talk about the load development analysis Model 2.0, which is in Excel. And this model is available for free. We're going to provide a link to it below the video on YouTube and also in our article write-up in our website. Now, this model 2.0 is a new version from what we had previously developed and made available. And the changes really have been driven by two things. One, we had many questions over the years since that model's been available about how to use it. And there are a lot of questions around how to customize it, how to interpret the results. So hopefully with this new version, we've made things a little bit easier. And secondly, I want to cover a brief tutorial on how to use this model in terms of taking your load data and putting it into the model so you guys can actually do some analysis on it. The second area of information is I'm going to cover briefly just some general statistical analysis and the importance of understanding some basic statistics concepts. We'll also cover the importance of the data collection and how much data or how much samples of the data that you need to collect in order to have some meaningful analysis. And it'll also provide some tips and guidance in analyzing and interpreting the results of your load data to find an optimal load. So let's go ahead and open up the Excel analysis model. Of course, in order to use this, you're going to need Microsoft Excel. And this file does include macros. It's a .xlm file. So you're going to probably need to adjust the security settings on Excel in order to allow these macros to run. Now you'll notice in terms of the file itself, there's basically one tab. In an example I'm showing today, there's a sample data, and the only reason I have this included for the purposes of this video is to help expedite data entry, so you don't have to sit there and watch me enter cells of data. At the very top of the model is a table. This table is included just so you have a place to enter data about the load itself, and the location the data was captured and some of the environmental conditions under which the chronograph data was captured. So for example, we have here a place to store information for the cartridge, the bullet used, the brass, the powder, the primer. So these are the loading components. And then under location and environmentals, you've got the location, temp, station pressure, humidity, and density altitude. So all of this would be entered so you have information about all of these loads that you're capturing data for. Now, the data that you enter actually goes into these yellow cells. So there's space to enter 10 different loads. So these are your incremental powder loads, as well as the muzzle velocity measurements for shots 1 through 5. Now, you don't have to use all 5 data slots. If you just capture data for 1 or 3, that's fine. If you only do, 3 or 5 different loads, that's fine as well. Now, if you do more shots per load, more than 5 shots per particular load, this model cannot accommodate that. So you may actually want to perhaps tabulate this information into a separate model, or you're kind of on your own in terms of modifying the Excel model to accommodate more shots than 5. But I found for my purposes, 5 seems to be enough. Okay, so before we move on, why don't we go ahead, for purposes of providing a demonstration, we'll go ahead and talk about entering data. Now, your chronograph data could be taken a number of different ways. One, if depending on the chronograph you use, whether it be a magnetospeed, a lab radar, an Euler or a beta chrony, that information can be captured either through writing it down, which is something I used to do up until a couple of years ago. I'd actually have all of this written down at the range as I chronographed my loads. But now with some of these newer models, they actually have SD cards. So you can get all of this information off an SD card. So for example, here is a bunch of shot strings from a lab radar. And if I open up, for example, shot string 3, you'll see here that there's actually a comma separated value file. And I can open that up. And you'll see in here that for this shot string, I've got 5 shots. This is the velocity at the muzzle. And I can actually copy this and bring it right into my model. So that's just an example of being able to use the files directly off of your SD card from whatever chronograph that you use. So no matter how you capture information, you're basically going to have to enter the information into this model. So let's go ahead and do that using some of the sample data that I've already captured. So in this example, I'm going to bring this in up here at the top. So I've got a 6x47 shooting Sierra 110s with Laprua brass, Varget powder, and I'm using the CCI 450s. And my chronograph data, as well as my load data, would be brought into these yellow cells. And the model automatically calculates a number of things. First, you've got the mean. This is a calculated average. The median, and the minimum velocity and the maximum velocity. And these stats are for this first load data. So again, for load 2, I've got my mean, median, min, and max, so on and so forth, all the way through load 10. Beneath that, in gray, are the standard deviations velocity, which is basically the mean velocity less 1 standard deviation, and then plus 1 standard deviation, and plus or minus 2 standard deviations beneath that. We'll go ahead and ignore this for now. We'll cover this later in this video. And at the bottom, I've got the standard deviation, the extreme spread, and the average speed increase going from one load to the next. Some of these statistical measures, we'll go ahead and discuss these later in the video. I just wanted to explain to you what's in this table. And then beneath that, I've got a couple of graphs. One of the pieces of feedback in terms of the old model was, depending on the data that you enter, sometimes these charts will look funny, and users used to have to go in and manually changing. Now I've created a macro to automatically reset these charts just by clicking on Reset Chart. It'll automatically rechart these to make it look correct. And the first chart, what you're looking at in the blue line, that is the average velocity per load charted. So the gray dots, looking at the legend, are the actual shots, the velocities per shot. And then the blue line is the average. Now beneath that is the second chart, which has the mean plotted with black squares. So this is the average velocity per load. That's the black line and the black squares. And then the blue line shows the deviation in terms of plus or minus 1 standard deviation from the mean, and the green shows plus or minus 2 standard deviations from the mean. So in terms of interpreting this and knowing what this means, we'll cover this when we cover some basic statistical concepts at the back end of this video. So let's go back to our data. Let's suppose that you don't have 10 different loads. If you only had 6 loads, that's fine. You can go ahead and enter in what data you have, or let's say instead of shooting 5 shots per load, you only shot 3. Again, you can do that. Just enter what data you have in the table, and then when you're done entering your data, just hit Reset Chart. So again, just the way these charts are set up, it tries to plot the rest of this data that's not there. So this blue line basically shows where the data terminates. So the information you're looking at basically is this part of the graph. All right. Why don't we go ahead and talk about what some of these other things on the table mean. So in order to do that, why don't we go ahead and clear our load data. Again, you'll notice I pressed the clear load data, and that basically takes the data out of the yellow portion, and we're going to go ahead and bring back in our sample data that we have to work with. Now you'll notice under standard deviation extreme spread, there is some color coding going on here. Some cells are light green, some cells are white, some cells are a darker green. The way I've this set up is I have some conditional formatting set up in the model, which in order to interpret this, the way this set up is the darker green the cell is, the better that particular load is for that particular statistic. So for example, low standard deviation and low extreme spread is a good thing. That means that there's less deviation or more consistency in terms of the velocities that were measured for that particular load. So you'll notice here that the 6 and the 2.4 in terms of extreme spread standard deviation, those are darker green than these others. And again, if you look at the chart, you notice that it's pretty tight there in terms of it's fairly consistent with velocities. The other one here is the 35.8. And again, you'll notice, or this one, the 37.4. So those are darker green. Now, in terms of the speed increase, what it's looking at is what's the average speed increase going from one velocity to the next, both below and above it. So here at 11.7 average speed increase, that's your 36.6. So again, people talk about the flat spots in the curve, and this is what we're talking about, where it's not increasing very much from one load to the next. So here, again, darker green's better. And you'll notice that this does have a little bit higher standard deviation and extreme spread, but it looks like there's just one data point that looks like that might be an outlier. We'll talk about outliers and just spread overall here in just a moment as we get into some of the statistical concepts. But that's what this color coding means. So just think of it as darker green means that particular statistic is better versus the other loads. So let's go ahead and try actually clearing this load data, and we'll try a different load. Let's go with, actually this is 6.5 by 47. So now we have a different cartridge and different load data. And again, you'll notice that the chart is messed up. We can fix that simply by clicking on the Reset Chart button. And here you'll notice that as we look at the load data, we can either look at the chart itself, and we see here that this looks like a flat spot, the 41.6 load, but there's a pretty wide spread in terms of the actual velocities that were recorded. Here we have fairly consistent velocities, fairly flat, going from one to the next. Actually, this is green all the way across all three of these key statistics. The velocity, though, is relatively slower given the others. Another option here is at 42.2, which has a pretty decent level of consistency, but it's fairly low in terms of the speed increase versus the node below and above. So the question here is, which one do you want to go with? This one looks like a really good option, the 40.1. If you want to go a little bit faster, this one here, the 41.3, looks like it might be a good option as well. So that's just one way of interpreting these results. Now, let's suppose that we actually wanted to flag this one as the best load. And we wanted to save this file as its own file to come back to. We can do that simply by clicking the Save Load Analysis file. And we get a little note here that says that that file's been saved. And it gives you the name of that file. And now we can reuse this model as is. That file is archived. And if we go back to our files, we can see here that that's the file that we just saved. And coming back to our model, we can now go ahead and clear this load data out, and we can plot in a totally different set of loads. So for example, we're going to do a 6XC shooting 105 burgers next. So again, in this example, we have a different set of load data. We're shooting burger 105 hybrids. And again, first place I usually like to start is just looking at this first chart to see where do I have fairly consistent velocities. So at the 41.4 and the 42.6. And then also where on the average means am I seeing relatively little change going from one load to the next. So again, the 41.4 looks pretty good, as well as the 42.6. This one here actually is highest screen. There's very little change for the 42.4 given the node below and above it. And again, this seems fairly consistent, not as consistent as the 42.6. So again, I would probably start by looking somewhere in this range, maybe changing the charges, looking at 42.5 and maybe testing jump depth. But this part of the curve, when I look at the data that's been collected, seems to be the most promising. Again, if I want to export this out, I can save that load analysis file. And again, when it saves the file, it actually saves the cartridge type, the bullet type, the powder, and then the date that this analysis was done. So that's the naming. It actually creates that name automatically from the data that you entered here at the top. Let's go back to the original data that we were using, the 6x47. All right, we'll go ahead and fix the chart. Now, one of the things that is interesting is how do we combine this with group data? So for example, if we're using a lab radar or even a magnetospeed where we've mounted it on let's say a chrono mount, like a Wiser Precision chrono mount, so it's off the barrel, and we're actually capturing group data as well, can we combine this with our chronograph data? And the answer is yes, it's fairly simple. As long as you take a photograph of the targets, and so we'll go ahead and provide an example, you can actually show those groups right underneath this table. The way you do that is you need to have that file saved, that photograph, go to Insert on our menu, then we're going to Pictures, and we're going to look for that file that we saved, the actual picture, and here's the one that we have. So we have images for each of our loads, and we're going to basically copy this and crop it for each load. So here's the 35.6. We double click the image, and that brings up the menu up here, and we go to crop. We're going to go select the shape of our crop to circle. So you can adjust what part of the image is peeking through your crop. So that's the 35.6. And we can take that and change the size accordingly. We're going to do this again for the next one. We again double click it, go to crop, and we're going to change the crop shape to circle. And so that looks getting close. Okay, there's a 35.8. Again, we'll make this about the same size. We'll do one more just so you guys get the idea. So again, the next one we want is this 36. So again, double click it, select crop to shape. Okay, there's our 36. Again, we'll make this about the same size as the other ones. Okay, so there's 3 of them in a row, so you kind of get the idea. So you can go ahead and bring your groups beneath it, and gives you one other piece of data from which to do your analysis. Pretty easy. Okay, now that I've walked through the model, let's talk a little bit about how to interpret this chart. And before we go there, we'll need to cover a few concepts related to statistics. So in order to think about the data that we're gathering and how it might be used to interpret the data that we're actually seeing, let's talk first about what we call the normal distribution, often called the bell curve. So as you're gathering data over the chronograph around the rifle muzzle velocities for a particular load, those velocities will tend to vary around an average or mean. So if you think of that in terms of plotting it on an XY chart or an histogram, and for each shot that has the same velocity, you could start to build a vertical bar graph. As an example, if we take 10 shots, and we have 3 here that landed at 2950, we had 2 that landed at 2949, 2 that landed at 2951, then 1 each at 2948 and 2952, and then we had 1 sitting down here at 2945. So that's an example of having 10 shots. You chronograph them, and if you put them on a histogram, how they might fall out. So if you fired 20 shots and continued this pattern of gathering data and plotting it, and you then shot 30, and your data now starts to spread out a little bit because you have more data points. Then you shoot 40 shots. You'll notice that as you gather more and more data, the data will start to cluster around the mean. They'll get more data points in the center. And as an example, by the time you hit 60, in this example that this is just illustrating the point, it'll begin to represent what we call a normal distribution, or this bell curve shape. So in this example, we have 60 shots. We have a min of 2944 and a max of 2956 as far as muzzle velocities. The extreme spread is simply the difference between the min and the max. So that's 12 in this example. And then the standard deviation is 2.67. So having a large sample size, or the more data you capture over the chronograph, that gives you more confidence in the conclusions being made with the data. So how many shots really is statistically significant in terms of sample size? Like how many shots are required? Well, that's an interesting question. It's what we call statistical significance. As for finding an optimal load, the statistical significance implies that the number of measured observations or the number of shots with the chronograph is really representative of their broader population. So for example, if you shot 5 shots for a particular load, is that the same speed you would get over 1,000 shots? Or maybe even 100 shots, the number of shots you might fire in a match. So in order to have some confidence in that measurement, you need probably more than one. And there's actually a calculation in terms of sample size. The size of that sample is really determined by a couple of things. First, the population, the confidence level, and then the margin of error in terms of your forecasts. So if you have a 90% confidence rate with a margin error of 5%, you would need 28 shots if the population size was 30. Even if you drop down the confidence level to 80 with a margin error of 20, you would still need 8 samples or 8 shots over the chrono. So the question is, where did we get the 5-shot standard? Well, it's really a remnant of traditional methods. So for example, if you have a loading block, typically, those are organized by 5 rows by 10 columns. So when I look at that, that's 5 shots per load for 10 different loads. We also commonly do 5-shot groups. The confidence level to draw inferences and conclusions is likely low unless you have consistently low SD and extreme spreads across all of the samples. So having an adequate number of measurements is fairly important in order to have some confidence in your load data. So the bottom line is the more data points that you collect, meaning the larger sample size in terms of shots over chronograph, is going to improve your level of confidence in your ability to draw valid and meaningful conclusions about the optimal load in your rifle. Now, we've talked a lot about the standard deviation statistic. So what is it? If you think of the normal distribution of shots, so for example, if you again have, let's say 30 shots and you plot them over a histogram and it starts to develop this bell curve shape, the standard deviation quantifies the amount of variation or dispersion of a set of data values. A low standard deviation indicates that the data points tend to be close to the mean, while a high SD indicates that the data points are spread out wider over a range of values. Additionally, the SD is commonly used to measure confidence in statistical conclusions. So why is a standard deviation important? Well, the standard deviation is commonly used to measure confidence in statistical conclusions, or it can be used to estimate or extrapolate the expected range of values possible. So if you look at the mean velocity of a load and you take the standard deviation plus or minus 1 around that mean, 68% of all the shots for that particular load are going to fall within plus or minus 1 standard deviation of that mean. If you go plus or minus 2 standard deviations, roughly 95% of the shots for that particular load are going to fall within that range. So if you go plus or minus 3, that's 99 or almost 100% of the possible velocities that you could expect for a particular load are going to be plus or minus 3 standard deviations from the mean. So it's a quick way to determine what's the possible range of values that you could expect in terms of velocities for a particular load. So example, if we take the chart of 5 shots per load data and we plot them in our chart, and we think of them as a normal bell curve distribution, and you overlay that bell curve on this load data, you can start to think of the range of possible values for a particular load. So if we take this and actually start to plot this concept in this example, and we look at the load data, and And the mean, again, is the blue square. And we go plus or minus 1 standard deviation. Roughly 68% of the expected range of velocities for that load can be visualized within that chart. And if you go plus or minus 2 standard deviations, represented by this green arrow, that represents 95% of the range of expected velocities for that load. So again, the wider the range, the more variance you would expect to see in terms of velocities. So that's why you want a real tight set of load data. And again, you want some confidence in that load data. So if you think you found an optimal load, it might be good to test it with more shots, just to be sure. Now again, you can take this data and look at plotting the mean plus or minus 1 or plus or minus 2 standard deviations to actually visualize what is the range of possible values for a particular load. Coming back to Excel, we now go back to chart 2. This is what this chart represents. It's meant to show your mean plus or minus 1 standard deviation, which is 68% of the potential values that you would expect to chronograph a particular load. And then plus or minus 2 standard deviations is 95% of the possible range of values that you would expect for that particular load. It gives you some way to visualize the range of what's possible or what you might expect given the data that you've collected. Again, tighter is better. So for example, here at 37.2 or 35.8, low variance. One other factor to consider is the data collected, is it within the realm of what you would normally expect? So for example, in this 36.6, you have a nice tight group clustering just around 3,000, but you have one sitting down here that's almost 20 FPS slower. You might consider that an outlier. That might be an edge case that somehow made it within this 5-shot group. So the question you need to consider is that a data point that you can discount as being a little bit of an anomaly given some other factor in your loading process, such as maybe the case mouth had a burr or who knows what. So that's something to consider as you interpret the data as to how much of this data do you really want to believe, and is this really due to the load or some other exogenous factor in your loading process that could account for some of these anomalies that you're seeing in your data. Okay, so that pretty much takes us through some of the key considerations in terms of load data. One other thing to mention is the 10-shot load development approach. We get a number of questions regarding 10-shot load development. The one thing to remember is in order for that methodology to work, again, think of the level of spread. If, for example, you take one shot at 35.6 and your first shot really ends up, let's say in this case, ends up being at this data point, 35.6, and you move on to 35.8, and your next shot is down here at 29.25. The next shot ends up way up here. So again, it's possible that you could be hitting high at the high end of the range and the low end of the range from shot to shot. So being able to determine an optimal load given that level of variance within a 10-shot load development leaves a lot of room for error in interpreting where your optimal load is. So again, in order for that approach to work, you really want very tight SDs and extreme spreads. And in fact, I would advise that if your SDs are not single digits on a regular basis, that particular load analysis approach may not be for you. With that, as sort of the parting thought, we'll go ahead and post this model up and make it available. It's my hope that you guys found this video useful and interesting. If you like it, please give it a thumbs up on YouTube, share it with your friends on Facebook, leave us your comments on YouTube or Facebook below. And again, remember, life's an adventure. Stay on target.